Congratulations! You've just been born into one of the great royal houses of medieval Europe. Your father is the king. Your mother is also basically the king, in the sense that she is his niece, and they share roughly the same DNA as a sibling pair. The midwife is already worried about your jaw, which arrived first and looks more enthusiastic than the rest of your face. Welcome to the most prestigious medical case study in European history. Your family tree is a wreath. So here is how this happened. Medieval European royalty did not see marriage as a romance thing. It was a contract, signed in blood and rye bread, designed to consolidate land, lock down inheritance, and make sure no peasant ever sat anywhere near the throne. To pull that off, the royal families invented a concept called Ebenbürtigkeit, which is German for equal birth, and which in practice meant you can only marry someone whose great-great-grandfather was just as inbred as yours. The math gets ugly fast. There were maybe 30 families in Europe considered grand enough to marry into. Subtract the ones at war with you. Subtract the religious mismatches. Subtract the ones already plotting your assassination. Subtract the ones whose daughters had already been promised to Habsburgs. Which is most of them, by the way. What is left is your cousin. Possibly your aunt. Definitely someone you saw at the family Easter feast last spring. Then add in the practical reasons. Cousin marriages kept the territory inside the family. They prevented inheritance from leaking out to rival dynasties. They strengthened political alliances by giving everyone a shared grandfather to argue over. And, conveniently, they meant your dowry was just moving from one of your dad's wings of the palace to another. Efficient. Catastrophic for your nervous system. But efficient. There was also the matter of religion. A Catholic princess could not marry a Protestant prince without setting off a war, and a Protestant prince was not going to convert just to court a Habsburg. So the marriage pool shrank again. Then France did not want you marrying anyone Habsburg, and Austria did not want you marrying anyone French, and the English were drifting off the Catholic map entirely. By the time the diplomats finished crossing out names, the only people left on the list were the ones whose portraits already lived in your hallway. The Pope said it was fine. Actually, you would think the Catholic Church might have a problem with this. The Church technically did have a problem with this. Back in 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, Pope Innocent III sat down, took a long look at how messy European marriage had become, and ruled that you could not marry anyone within 4 degrees of consanguinity. That is first cousins, second cousins, third cousins, and basically anyone who had shown up to your baptism uninvited. The catch was that the Pope also had the authority to grant dispensations from his own rule, and the dispensations were available. They were, in fact, very available. If you were royal, the dispensation was practically a punch card. 5 cousin marriages and the 6th one is free. The Vatican waved through Habsburg on Habsburg unions for centuries, partly because the Habsburgs were paying for half the cathedrals in Europe, and partly because everyone involved had agreed that dynastic stability was holier than the prohibition itself. So your parents went to Rome, smiled politely, kissed a ring, paid a fee, and came back with a piece of parchment that legalized them having a child whose chromosomes were, statistically speaking, doing the work of about 1.5 people instead of 2. That is where you came in. Welcome to the Habsburg special. Let us narrow this down. Across all the inbred royal lines in medieval and early modern Europe, one family ran the experiment harder than the rest. The Habsburgs. The Habsburg motto, which you will be expected to memorize before you can read your own name, was Bella gerent alii tu Felix Austria nube. Translation: let others wage wars. You, fortunate Austria, marry. It is, on its face, a beautiful sentiment about diplomacy through alliance. In practice, it was an instruction manual for spending 300 years tying knots inside the same handful of bedrooms. Between 15, 16, and 1700, more than 80% of Spanish Habsburg marriages were consanguineous. King Philip II of Spain managed to marry both his first cousin Mary of Portugal and, later, his niece Anna of Austria. He treated the family tree the way some people treat all-you-can-eat shrimp. King Philip IV, the one who paid Velázquez to immortalize the family chin, married his niece Mariana of Austria when she was 14 and he was 50. She gave him your dad, or your grandfather, or both. It honestly depends which Habsburg you are. By the time the family reached your generation, the inbreeding coefficient, the technical number geneticists use to measure how related your parents are, had climbed to historic levels. A first cousin marriage gives a child an F value of about 0.0625. An uncle-niece marriage runs around 0.125. A parent-child pairing, the thing we all agree is genuinely off the table, sits at 0.25. Your cousin Charles? We will get to him. His F value broke the parent-child barrier. He was more inbred than a child of incest, and his parents were technically uncle and niece. The math is doing something to me. Your jaw is doing something strange already. Let us talk about the most visible feature of being you, the Habsburg jaw. What you will notice first, somewhere around month 4, is that your bottom jaw is launching itself forward like a tiny aggressive drawer. The proper medical name is mandibular prognathism. The historical name is looking like every other portrait on the wall. It runs in the family because, well, almost everything runs in the family at this point. And a 2019 study published in the Annals of Human Biology had 10 maxillofacial surgeons score 66 royal portraits and concluded that the more inbred a Habsburg was, the bigger their chin got. Science. The jaw made eating difficult. Closing your mouth was, frankly, optional. Speech came out slurred. Your tongue had nowhere comfortable to live. You drooled enough that a servant had a job description that was just the dribble cloth. The most famous portrait painters of the era, Velázquez included, became extremely skilled at painting that face from angles that suggested you were thinking about philosophy rather than struggling to keep your soup inside your mouth. You also got the Habsburg lip, which is the lower lip's contribution to the project. Heavy, hanging, slightly purple. It pairs nicely with the jaw, in the sense that a flat tire pairs nicely with a flat battery. But hey, at least it photographs well. Wait, no, photography is not invented yet. Painting it is. Your portrait will hang in a hallway somewhere for 4 centuries while tourists whisper, "Oh my God." Childhood was a medical experiment. So what does a day in your tiny, valuable, genetically compromised life look like? You wake up in a room the size of a small parish church. There are tapestries on the walls because the walls themselves are damp enough to grow a small kingdom of mold. The fire was lit by someone who has been awake since 4 in the morning solely to make sure you do not get cold. You will not see this person's face for 15 years. You will, however, see your physician's face approximately every 90 minutes. The physician's job is mostly to bleed you. Medieval and early modern medicine ran on a beautiful 4 humor theory that suggested almost every illness was caused by having too much blood, too much yellow bile, too much black bile, or too much phlegm. The treatment, conveniently, was to remove some. You will be bled for fevers, for headaches, for sluggishness, for melancholy, for energy, for too much energy, for sleeping wrong, and for being 3. By age 6, you will have been opened up like a tap so many times your body will have, as a sort of compromise, just stopped making the same amount of blood. When the bleeding does not work, the next move is exorcism. If you, the royal heir, are sickly or convulsive or staring at walls in a way the court does not like, the obvious explanation is not extreme genetic disadvantage but demons. Priests will be brought in, Latin will be muttered, holy water will be flung, your mother will sob, and your father will rearrange his face into an expression that means, "I really hope the heir would not be like this one." Then comes the tutor. Boys around age 6 get a male tutor for reading, writing, Latin, and a healthy fear of God. You will learn 3 languages, all of which you will speak with the same slurred, jaw-impaired drawl. You will be taught classical philosophy that you cannot pronounce, history of dynasties that you cannot keep straight, and military tactics that you will never use because nobody trusts you near a horse. Girls fare a little differently. Your sisters, if you have any, get tutored in music, dance, languages, and the art of keeping a face neutral while being told their future husband is, again, their cousin. They will be betrothed in infancy. They will be shipped to other courts by the time they hit puberty. They will write letters home in code about how their new husband smells like horse glue. They will not be allowed to come home, and through all of it, you will be poked, measured, inspected. Doctors will examine your urine in pewter bowls. Astrologers will write reports about whether Saturn was rude to your moon on the morning you were conceived. Painters will be brought in to immortalize how you look on a good day. Your jaw will be the talk of 3 continents. Court protocol is a full-time job. You will also discover that being royal means most of your waking hours are taken up by ceremony. The Spanish Habsburg court ran on something called etiqueta, an absurdly rigid system of rules governing every gesture, garment, doorway, and meal. Nobody touched you without permission. Nobody spoke to you unless you spoke first. Nobody made eye contact past a certain rank. If a duke entered the room and a count was already standing, the count had to back out backwards. Your morning began with a public ritual called the lever, lifted directly from Versailles practice. Various nobles, ranked precisely, were allowed into your bedchamber to watch you wake up. One handed you a shirt, another handed you breeches, another handed those nobles their gloves. The order in which these handoffs occurred had been argued about by courtiers for 3 generations. The penalty for getting the order wrong was career ending. You ate alone, on a raised dais, in front of an audience. You drank from a cup handed to you by a kneeling official whose entire job for life was that cup. If you laughed at the wrong moment, the dinner conversation died. If you sneezed, a dozen people coughed in sympathetic embarrassment. You were not a person. You were a slow, ornate ritual that occasionally produced an heir. Sleep was its own production. You went to bed at a set hour. A noble of high rank turned down your sheets. A different noble of slightly lower rank held the candle. A third noble said the prayer. Then you lay there, surrounded by drafts and incense, listening to the palace guards change shift outside the door, while a court physician somewhere down the hall consulted your most recent urine sample and decided whether you needed to be bled again before breakfast. Your wedding will be arranged before you can walk. While we are on the subject of horror, let us cover your love life. You were probably betrothed before your second birthday. The contract was signed by ambassadors you have never met, on behalf of a child you have never seen, in a foreign court that uses different forks. There were diplomats arguing over your future bedroom for months before you took your first solid food. The terms included a dowry, a list of territories to be transferred, and a clause specifying which saints you were allowed to pray to after the move. Your future spouse was, almost without exception, a relative. First cousin was the safest bet. Second cousin was considered refreshingly diverse. If your kingdom was particularly small and particularly cornered, you might be promised to your uncle, which made family Christmas notably tense for everyone involved. You met your fiancé, if you were a Habsburg prince, at some elaborate handover ceremony in a tent on the French border, where she was stripped of her French clothes by French ladies-in-waiting, and then redressed in Spanish clothes by Spanish ladies-in-waiting, while diplomats from both sides made sure neither set of fabric crossed the line. This actually happened. It was called the Exchange of the Princesses. People wrote essays about it. When you finally married, the wedding night was supervised. Real people watched. Witnesses had to confirm the union was consummated, because if it was not consummated, the marriage could be annulled, and then the entire treaty fell apart, and somebody had to start a war about it. So your first time, royal teen, was a public event held in front of approximately a dozen middle-aged aristocrats with notebooks. Try not to think about that part too hard. Or do. Maybe it helps. The wedding itself was a multi-week affair. Banquets that started at noon and ended at dawn. Fireworks that occasionally set the palace gardens on fire. Hunts, plays, jousts, a bullfight or three. The whole thing cost what a small province made in a decade, and you, the bride or groom, sat at the center of it with your jaw doing its thing, smiling for a series of painted portraits that future tourists will whisper about. Meet Charles II. Now let us get specific. Meet your cousin. Actually, by this point, more like your everything. Charles II of Spain, king, heir, catastrophe. Charles, born in 1661, was the final boss of Habsburg inbreeding. The geneticist Gonzalo Alvarez and his team at the University of Santiago calculated his coefficient of inbreeding from a family tree of over 3,000 relatives, going back 16 generations. The number they landed on was 0.254. To translate, Charles was statistically more inbred than the offspring of a brother and sister. His parents were Philip IV and his niece Mariana, already cursed, but the entire family line behind them was so collapsed in on itself that the math went off a cliff. The result was a person. Charles did not speak until age 4. He did not walk until age 8, possibly 10. He had a tongue too large for his mouth, which combined with the family chin made eating a full-contact sport. He suffered seizures. He had at least one undescended testicle. He could not reproduce. He had hallucinations. He vomited frequently. He sometimes simply collapsed. The court, naturally, concluded that he was bewitched. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. The Spanish royal household paid for repeated exorcisms throughout his life, and at one point his confessors decided his condition was caused by a curse placed on him in childhood through a cup of chocolate. He was 30 when he asked his priest to formally exorcise him. He did this regularly. He somehow ruled Spain for 35 years. By ruled, historians generally mean was placed in a chair while other people argued around him. When advisors brought him state papers, he often signed them without comprehension. When ambassadors visited, they wrote home that the king had drooled through the audience and forgotten their names. When his mother died, he reportedly tried to dig her up to look at her one more time. The Joanna the Mad gene was, apparently, still active. When he died in 1700, the court ordered an autopsy. The doctor's report, which you can still read if you enjoy ruining your afternoon, includes the following phrases. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were rotten and gangrenous. His skull was full of water. He had a single black testicle the size of a hazelnut, and his body, by the autopsy's account, did not contain a single drop of blood. He left no heir. The throne went to the French Bourbons. The Spanish Habsburg line ended on him. 3 centuries of strategic marriage and the dynasty extinguished itself by walking, slowly, into its own bloodstream. The other disasters in the wing. Charles is the headline. But your extended family has plenty of footnotes. Take your great-great-great-aunt, Joanna of Castile, married Philip the Handsome in 1496, 6 children, all eventually Habsburg jaw recipients. When Philip died in 1506, Joanna allegedly refused to be parted from his body. She kept the coffin near her bed, occasionally had it open to check on him, kissed his feet, and, by some accounts, traveled across Spain with the corpse in a procession. She got the nickname Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Now, some historians today push back on this and argue Joanna was probably clinically depressed and being politically sidelined by men who wanted her crown. Her diagnosis may have had less to do with her brain and more to do with her father and her husband, both very urgently needing her not to be queen. So the corpse story might be true, it might be a smear. It is, either way, the kind of family lore that goes on the holiday card. Then there is Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias, son of Philip II. His parents were double first cousins. Don Carlos had unequal leg lengths, one shoulder higher than the other, and a temper that escalated from spirited to made a shoemaker eat a pair of shoes he did not like. Yes, that happened. He once threw himself down a staircase chasing a servant. He tried to stab the Duke of Alba. His own father had him locked in a tower at the Alcázar of Madrid, where he died 6 months later. The official cause was natural. The unofficial cause has been argued by every Northern European Protestant pamphleteer for the last 400 years. And while we are naming names, your distant cousins, the Ptolemies of Egypt, sibling marriers since 285 BC, set the world record for endurance dynastic incest. Cleopatra, the famous one, married her brother Ptolemy XIII when she was 18 and he was 10. Then, after his convenient drowning, she married her other brother Ptolemy XIV. The Ptolemies did not survive on their genetics. They survived on a Mediterranean economy too lucrative to let collapse. Your family, by contrast, did not have a Mediterranean economy. Your family had Spain, and Spain was running on bullion from the New World and praying nobody noticed the king could not chew. Half your siblings will not make it. Now for the part nobody puts on the painted ceiling, the body count. Researchers studying 71 Habsburg families and over 500 recorded pregnancies found that almost 21% of Habsburg infants died in their first year and that only about half of all Habsburg children reached age 10. Compare that to a Spanish peasant village of the same era, where roughly 80% of children made it past 10. So statistically, your odds of dying in childhood were higher if you grew up with 500 servants, 3 palaces, and a personal chaplain than if your mother was kneading bread in a hovel with a leaky roof. This is one of the great cosmic jokes of pre-modern Europe. You had everything: velvet, gold, doctors paid handsomely to do nothing useful, and the kid in the village down the road, the one who slept on straw, was statistically more likely to see his own teenage years than you were. The kid in the hovel had genetic diversity. You had a closet full of brocade, and a heart that was getting confused about which side to beat on. If you survived infancy, congratulations. The next gauntlet was childhood disease: smallpox, plague, measles, dysentery, anything respiratory. Your weakened immune system, courtesy of the family policy on partners, gave each of these diseases an easier path than they got in the general population. Your physician, armed with leeches and prayer, was not going to save you. He was going to bleed you again, and then bill your dad. Half your siblings simply will not appear in the dynastic portraits. They are, somewhere, in a chapel under a slab the size of a placemat. The painters will arrive once a year, line up the survivors, and quietly leave a gap where last winter's baby should have been standing. Nobody mentions the gap. You will learn early that the gap is something the family does not say out loud. The whole empire collapses because of your genes. Here is where the inbreeding stops being just a personal medical drama and starts being a continental political event. The Spanish Habsburgs spent 300 years assembling the most lucrative empire on earth. They held Spain, much of Italy, the Low Countries, vast stretches of the Americas, the Philippines, parts of North Africa, and the financial backbone of Catholic Europe. And then, because they kept marrying each other, they produced a final heir, Charles II, who could not produce one of his own. His doctors blamed the chocolate curse witchcraft. The actual explanation was that you cannot fold genetics in half forever and expect new shapes to come out. When Charles died, all of that empire became a question. Multiple European powers had their own Habsburg cousins ready to inherit it, including the French House of Bourbon and the Austrian Habsburgs themselves. Nobody could agree. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1714, killed somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million people, redrew the borders of Europe, kicked off a century of Bourbon rule in Spain, ended Spanish hegemony for good, and made everyone involved very, very tired. The proximate cause of all this was a man whose autopsy found a heart the size of a peppercorn. And here is the bitter punchline. The whole point of the marriages was to keep the empire from being divided. The whole point of the dispensations, the cousin weddings, the niece betrothals, the dowry treaties, the Latin contracts, and the painted ceilings was to consolidate, to prevent fragmentation, to make sure the land stayed together. And the empire, the very thing the inbreeding was meant to preserve, fragmented anyway, because the last man in the line was too genetically compromised to produce a son. They protected the bloodline so hard that the bloodline ate itself, and then the empire it was supposed to protect went with it. 3 centuries of careful breeding to produce one bewitched, peppercorn-hearted king, and a war that killed nearly 1 million people. This is what nobody warns you about, royal baby. Your DNA is not just a personal inconvenience, it is a geopolitical instrument. The contents of your skull will rearrange treaties. The shape of your jaw will sell Velázquez prints in museum gift shops for the next 12 generations. The peppercorn-sized organ doing its best to pump your blood will, eventually, redraw the map of Europe. So when the midwife hands you over and your mother looks at you and smiles tightly through her own Habsburg jaw, know this: you are not merely a baby. You are an heir, an instrument, a portrait, a diagnosis,